There was a time when British detective fiction was full of men like Albert Campion. Not policemen, not private investigators, not professionals of any kind. They were amateurs, gentlemen, people who solved crimes not because it was their job, but because they had the freedom, the intelligence, and the social access to do so. For decades, this kind of character was central to British crime storytelling. But by the late 20th century, that figure had quietly begun to disappear from television. And that is what makes Campion, broadcast by the BBC between 1989 and 1990, so interesting. Because Albert Campion may well be the last gentleman detective to arrive on British television as a leading character. Albert Campion first appeared in the novels of Margery Allingham in the 1920s. At first glance, he seems slightly ridiculous. He wears round spectacles, he speaks with mild vagueness, he presents himself as harmless, slightly foolish, and even absent-minded. But that persona is deliberate. Behind it lies a mind that is quick, observant, and very difficult to deceive. Campion belongs to a very particular tradition of British detective fiction, the gentleman amateur. This type of character appears again and again in the golden age of detective stories. They are not professionals, they have no official authority. Instead, they possess something else that proves just as powerful: social freedom. A gentleman amateur can move through society in ways others cannot. He can attend country house gatherings, speak to servants, question criminals, and consult officials. He can appear almost anywhere without seeming out of place. That ability becomes the detective's greatest tool. Campion does not solve mysteries by commanding investigations. He solves them by understanding how people behave inside the social structures around him. This kind of character made perfect sense when the novels were first written. The golden age of detective fiction emerged in Britain during the interwar period. It is a world still heavily shaped by class structures, country houses, inherited titles, and complex social codes. In that environment, someone like Campion had a natural role. He could move between worlds. He understood the habits of the aristocracy, but was also comfortable speaking with ordinary people. He was, in effect, a social interpreter. The detective story became a puzzle not just about evidence, but about human behavior within a particular social order. Understanding the people involved meant understanding the crime. For readers of the time, this structure felt entirely natural. When the BBC adapted the character in Campion, they approached the material with considerable respect for its origins. The role of Campion was played by Peter Davison, already well known to television audiences. Davison brought exactly the qualities the character required. His Campion appears polite, mild, and slightly eccentric. But beneath that calm exterior, there is a constant intelligence at work. You can see the character thinking, observing, quietly assembling the pieces of a puzzle. The series itself followed the structure of the novels closely. Each story unfolded within a clearly defined social environment: country estates, small communities, or tightly connected groups of characters. The mystery was rarely about dramatic action. Instead, it was about relationships, motives, and hidden tensions within that environment. In that sense, the programme remained very faithful to the traditions of the Golden Age detective story. Yet by the time Campion appeared on television, the world of crime drama had already begun to change. For much of television history, amateur detectives were common. They appeared in many forms. Writers, aristocrats, journalists, and curious observers all found themselves solving mysteries. But by the late 20th century, the genre had shifted in a different direction. Crime drama increasingly focused on professionals: police officers, investigators, people whose job placed them inside an official system. This shift brought with it a new emphasis on procedure. Investigations now involved laboratories, forensic analysis, institutional structures, and complex investigative teams. The detective story was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming the police procedural. In that new environment, characters like Campion became harder to sustain. The gentleman amateur relies on a certain narrative assumption. that a private individual can move through society freely enough to investigate a crime. Earlier audiences accepted that idea without difficulty, but as crime drama moved towards greater realism, the assumption became more difficult to justify. Why would the police allow an outsider to interfere? Why would suspects cooperate? Why would an amateur have access to information controlled by official authorities? The genre began to close around professional investigators. The social freedom that once empowered the gentleman detective gradually disappeared. That is what makes BBC's Campion adaptation so fascinating. The series arrived at a moment when the tradition that created its central character was already fading. It was, in effect, a late echo of an earlier form of detective storytelling, but it was also a very elegant one, because the programme did not attempt to modernise Campion or force him into a procedural framework. Instead, it allowed the character to exist within the world that made sense for him, a world of country houses, social gatherings, private conversations, quiet observations. Within that setting, the gentleman detective still functioned perfectly. The puzzles remained satisfying, the characters remained believable, the stories unfolded with careful logic. One of the strengths of the Campion stories lies in their focus on personality. The crimes themselves are often intricate, but the solutions rarely depend on complex physical evidence. Instead, they depend on understanding people. Who resents whom? Who fears exposure? Who is pretending to be something they are not? Campion's talent lies in recognizing these patterns. He reads human behavior the way other detectives read laboratory reports. That emphasis on human psychology links the series very clearly to the traditions of Golden Age detective fiction. The mystery becomes a study of character, and the detective becomes a kind of observer of human nature. Seen in this light, Campion occupies a very interesting position in television history. It represents the end of a particular kind of detective hero, not because the story stopped working and not because audiences rejected the character, but because the wider genre moved in a different direction. Television increasingly preferred investigators with official authority, police teams, specialist units, professional detectives operating inside institutions. Within that environment, the gentleman amateur became a historical figure, a reminder of how detective stories once worked. Yet the appeal of the character has never completely vanished. Albert Campion remains one of the most distinctive detectives created during the golden age of crime fiction. He represents a style of investigation based not on force or authority, but on intelligence, patience, and social understanding. The BBC's adaptation preserved that character with considerable care. It allowed modern audiences to encounter a figure who belonged to an earlier storytelling tradition, a detective who solved mysteries simply by paying attention to the world around him. So when we look back at Campion, we are not simply looking at another television detective series, we are looking at the final appearance of a particular kind of hero, the gentleman amateur, a detective whose authority came not from a badge or a laboratory, but from social freedom, intelligence, and insight into human nature. For decades, characters like Albert Campion stood at the centre of British detective storytelling. By the end of the 20th century, they had largely disappeared from television. But thanks to this thoughtful BBC adaptation, we can still see how that tradition worked and why, for so long, it proved so compelling.